Okay, I have 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I think more people are still filing in, but we're going to go over a few quick introductory rules, and then we'll turn the podium over to Dr. Youngsteadt. So good afternoon and welcome to our National Pollinator Week webinar series. My name is Gabriella Garrison. I'm the Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and I'm also the coordinator for this group, the NC Pollinator Conservation Alliance. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're so pleased to have you as we celebrate National Pollinator Week, an annual event that is actually celebrated internationally to honor pollinator health, awareness, and conservation, among other things. Our presentation today will be brought to you by Dr. Elsa Youngsteadt of North Carolina State University, who's going to give you a glimpse into the lives of your local carpenter bees. So before we start, let's go over a few basic reminders, which I think most people are probably pretty familiar with at this point. So your microphones are muted when you came into the room, but if you have unmuted them, please go ahead and turn off your mics as well as your camera just to minimize distraction for our speaker. There will be lots of opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. So if during the presentation you have a question that comes to mind, go ahead and type it in the chat box at the bottom of your screen and we will answer it or address it at the end of the talk. And then finally, this webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel within the next several days. And I will send out an email once that has been posted to our YouTube site so that you can see it if you'd like. So just a really quick background on our group. Like I said, we are the North Carolina Conservation Alliance. We're a partnership of over 25 agencies and organizations with interest in pollinator conservation and outreach across the state. And within this organization, there are 6 committees, including the Plant Resources Committee, Outreach Committee, which is how these webinars are being brought to you today, Habitat Assessment, Research, Energy, and Pesticide Stewardship. And if you want to learn more about our group, you can check out our website, www.ncpollinatoralliance.org. And we're also on most social media outlets, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then this is just a quick glance at our partners. We're quite fortunate to have representation from many diverse and knowledgeable organizations, which I think really makes our group quite beneficial and impactful. And then just a reminder, I think most people are aware because if you signed up for this webinar, you saw the other webinars that we're offering this week. But tomorrow we're going to have John Gerwin from the Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh talking about our butterflies and moths in North Carolina. And then on Thursday, also from 1 to 2, we're going to have Lenny Lample from the Mecklenburg County Parks and Rec Department talk about beneficial insects. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so that Elsa can start loading her slides. And while she's doing that, I'm going to give you just a quick introduction to Elsa. She is an assistant professor of applied ecology at North Carolina State University. Her lab focuses on research in urban ecology, particularly ecology of insects and plant-insect interactions. Current projects in her lab are investigating how urban warming and socioeconomic status shape the ecology and evolution of bees and ants. And then outside the city, she also works on the pollination biology of rare plants. So it looks like, Elsa, you've got your slides up and loaded. So I will turn the podium over to you.
Okay, got it. Still, after years of Zooming, there's always these moments of, did I do it right? So thanks, Gabriella, and thank you all for being here. Happy Pollinator Week. So the topic of today is carpenter bees, which are probably the most recognized wild native bee in North Carolina. They're certainly the one I get the most questions about. And this is a view inside the nest of a carpenter bee, even though we see them the most in early spring when they're very active around their nests. These bees live 1 to 2 years. And so what I want to do today is dive into a little bit of that life cycle that's not quite so obvious when they're not, hovering in your face in April. which is what you see here. If you do know this bee, that's probably one of the interactions that you know it from. In the spring, you see females gnawing holes in your wooden structures, maybe your fence post, maybe your porch. And then you see males hovering around those same structures, maybe hovering in your face. And so they're really most on everybody's radar for a couple months in the spring. But I want to today kind of pull back the curtain on some of the rest of that life cycle. All of these grubs in here inside the nest are also bees, just as much as the bees that are hovering in your face. But before we dig into that life cycle and some of the behaviors that carpenter bees have throughout their life cycle, I do want to step back and talk actually about identification and make sure we're all on the same page, that we're all talking about the same bee. We'll talk about the difference between the sexes, the difference between carpenter bees and bumblebees, and then the difference between different species of carpenter bees. So first, male versus female bees. And this is an important distinction to be able to make because, like with all species of bees, male carpenter bees cannot sting you. So it's helpful to be able to tell the difference between males and females, which can sting. And the clearest difference, the bee on the left here is the male, and the one on the right is the female. And the clearest difference is that pale face patch in the male. Females have a face that's all black, whereas males have this obvious kind of yellow to ivory patch. Males also have bigger eyes, which depending on the light can also look kind of greenish. It's thought that they're bigger that's to do with their mating and territorial behavior. When they're hovering around a territory, those big eyes are better for spotting, potential males intruding in their territories or females who may be flying by and worthy of pursuit. And if a carpenter bee is making you feel threatened in the spring, it's often the males who are doing that because they're territorial. They're the ones that often get up in your face and hover. But now they cannot sting you. You can, in fact, grab them out of the sky with impunity if you want. They might buzz at you a little bit, but they can't sting. So that's the difference between males and females. But you also need to be able to tell carpenter bees from other species. And the species that they're most often mistaken for are bumblebees. And so I want to show you a few of the differences to clearly tell the difference between bumblebees and carpenter bees. And in this case, it's again an important distinction. Their lifestyle of bumblebees versus carpenter bees is very different. In fact, you probably wouldn't make the mistake if you saw the bees at their nests where the carpenter bees are nesting in wood and gnawing their nests. But when you see them out on flowers, they're harder to tell apart. But bumblebees actually go home to large social colonies with tens to hundreds of worker bees. They're some of the most effective garden pollinators, and they never nest in wood. You'll often find them nesting in old birdhouses, sometimes in wall voids, like old stone walls. A lot of them nest underground in old rodent burrows where you rarely actually see them. Carpenter bees do live in groups. We'll talk more about that, but they don't have actual colonies like bumblebees do. Each female who builds a nest also collects her own pollen and lays her own eggs. There aren't really workers. So to tell these very different species apart, I'm going to show you a few key things to look out for. And the first one is highlighted on these pictures. So the bee on the left is the carpenter bee, the one on the right is a bumblebee. And look at their abdomens at that rear end. On carpenter bees, it's very shiny, whereas on bumblebees, it's more velvety, hairy, and doesn't reflect as much light. So that's one difference to look out for. Another difference is just general overall body shape. Compared to bumblebees, carpenter bees have sort of more round, bulbous body segments. Their head is very big compared to their body, and they have a very round face, whereas bumblebees have this kind of narrow face and sort of more elongated segments. And then finally, if you're looking specifically at female bees, the legs are a good thing to check out. If you can get a good look at those, you'll see that female carpenter bees have a brush of hairs all over their hind legs where they carry pollen, whereas bumblebees have these kind of flat, shiny hind legs where they pack pollen on in a compact ball in the center of that leg. And here's another view of that where the pollen is actually present, maybe easier to tell the difference. Here's a carpenter bee with the pollen sort of scattered all over her hind legs compared to the bumblebee where it's in these compact balls on the sides. So, and then specific to males, so the leg difference was specific to females. Specific to males, we're looking at that pale face patch. Again, carpenter bees have it. Bumblebees, males do not have it. They have sometimes a kind of yellowish little mustache. So the fur on their face, I'm calling it fur. It's not really fur, but we can agree to just call it that. The fur on their face is sort of yellowish in male bumblebees, in some male bumblebees, but they never have the actual, surface of the face. What we'll call the skin is not yellow. So those are some ways you can tell bumblebees and carpenter bees apart. And finally, we need to talk about differences between large carpenter bees. Here in the East, we actually have 2 species of carpenter bees. This is the other one, Xylocopa micans, or the southern carpenter bee. It's, at least in the Piedmont of North Carolina, less common than the eastern carpenter bee. It gets more common toward the coast and then farther into southern states.
Bye, honey, have a good time. I don't know where the boy is.
And the southern carpenter bee, to tell it apart from the eastern, the females of the southern carpenter bee are entirely black. They don't have that yellow fuzz on their thorax the way the eastern carpenter bee does. And then the males look fairly similar, but they're smaller, and their abdomen and legs are a really pretty iridescent deep blue. So now that you can recognize our eastern carpenter bee, let's talk about its life cycle. And so this diagram gives you an overview of their life cycle throughout the year. For most bees, the life cycle lasts 1 year. For some, it lasts 2 years. Most bees, meaning most carpenter bees of this species, some live 1 year, some live 2. The big turnover between generations happens in the middle of the summer, like right now. But we're actually going to start in the spring. We'll kind of anchor the life cycle at that time of year when they're most obvious, when they're hovering around your porch, when they're hovering in your face. And the first thing that happens in the spring is that adult bees wake up from diapause, which is a state similar to hibernation. There's kind of powered down for the winter. And in Raleigh, in the Piedmont, this happens in late February to early March. Depending on your location, it may be earlier if you're in the coast or farther south. It may be later into the spring if you're in the mountains. But at some point in early spring, there's still some really cold days and nights, but on the warm days, the carpenter bees will come out and start foraging. And they're not really into full mating mode yet. It takes them a few weeks to ramp up their activity, but by the end of March in the Piedmont, you'll see the males staking out territories and hovering. Sometimes this is near nests, sometimes it's just around floral resources or in places that don't seem to make sense at all, but they're staking out territories, hovering in them, watching for females, chasing away intruding males. The females aren't always agreeable to being chased. You may see them actually drop out of the air and hide in the grass while a male continues to hover over her. That's what's going on in this picture on the bottom right. The female is hard to see down there in the grass, but she's hidden and just waiting for this guy to go away so she can get to work again, collecting pollen or working on her nest. Sometimes the females do like someone who's courting them. And so you occasionally see successful couples mating. A lot of times we think that this pairing off happens in the air, but every now and then successful couples come back to the ground and you can see them paired up. And once females have mated, then they get serious about nesting. So up to this point in the spring, lots of individual carpenter bees, males and females together, have been living in a nest tunnel together, the same one that they hibernated in the winter. But when a female is ready to start laying eggs, she kicks everybody else out of the nest that she claims. And at this point, males then start sleeping in other nooks and crannies, maybe abandoned nests or damaged nests. And then most of the female roommates are forced to go either create new nests of their own or find other nests to move into. The exception is sometimes a nesting female will let 1 or 2 female roommates stay in there with her. And these bees don't really seem to contribute much to the economy of that nest as a whole. They don't help, they're not really workers. It seems like from what we know so far that those females are just sort of hanging out waiting for the principal female to have a mishap so they could take over that nest. Or they may be waiting to just nest the next year entirely. A share of the females don't even attempt to nest in their first spring, and they wait until they are 2 years old to do that. So in any case, at this point, let's see, this is a video. You'll start to see bees chewing new nests, or you'll see piles of sawdust under old nests as the bees lengthen them and kind of remodel them. And especially at night, you'll even hear the gnawing sounds in the wood as the bees are extending their nests. And they do this entirely with their mandibles, their little bee jaws. And this is probably why carpenter bees have such big heads, like compared to bumblebees, because they've got to have big jaw muscles in there to drill these holes with their little insect mouth parts. This nesting is not completely limited to your porch and your fence. Carpenter bees certainly existed before we had built structures, and their natural habitat seems to be dead branches of trees or dead trees with fairly soft wood. This is an example of one that I found in a pine tree with some dead branches sticking out of it in the sandhills. This is the branch. Here we're zoomed in. You can see the little nest entrance underneath. I know it's an actual carpenter bee nest because I radio tracked a female bee to it and saw her go in. Here's another example of a nest in natural material, not a structure. This is from a dead tulip tree sapling in the Butner Game Lands. And this also actively had bees living in it. So it's possible that we have really kind of increased the population of carpenter bees by providing so much suitable nesting material in our own structures. But whatever they're nesting in, once carpenter bees have a nest and it's lengthened to their satisfaction, then the females start bringing back large amounts of pollen and nectar that they're foraging from flowers. So here's a female coming back to her nest. That's her nest hole. And you can see she's got this pale pollen packed all over her hind legs, very differently from how a bumblebee would carry pollen. And then on the bottom, here's the carpenter bee collecting nectar from a daffodil. And this is maybe a good point to note that although carpenter bees visit a lot of flowers to get enough pollen and nectar to feed their offspring in their nest, they're not necessarily outstanding pollinators. People often want to make that argument to sort of justify wanting to coexist with them. And I appreciate the argument, but the evidence for them being important pollinators is still pretty weak a lot of times. And the reason for this is that they have very large bodies and very short tongues. So they're a poor fit in a lot of flowers. Any tubular shaped flower, from a blueberry to a daffodil to sage, they don't fit inside, but they've got strong jaws and they're not afraid to use them. So what this bee has done is just bitten a hole in the base of the flower to bypass the normal entrance and get the nectar out of the bottom of the flower. No pollination is going to happen as a result of this interaction. They do the same thing to blueberries. In that case, because of the structure of that flower, they pollinate them a little bit. About 3 sort of nectar robbing visits equal like 1 good visit. But they're not the most efficient pollinators. They do pollinate some things. They're, for example, really great pollinators of passion vine or our native maypops. I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure they're really important for tulip trees, for them getting pollinated. And there's, of course, a lot of plants that nobody has looked at. Maybe there are some important relationships out there, but as far as being good garden pollinators, they definitely pale in comparison to, say, bumblebees. So with that pollen and nectar that the female carpenter bee collects, she goes back to the very end of the tunnel that she built. This is one that's been split open, so you can see it in cross section. And she'll pile all that pollen and nectar back in the bag. Possibly she kind of actually swallows it and regurgitates it and works it into this nice little loaf. And then she lays an egg on it. And this is a carpenter bee egg. They're huge. They're about almost a ½ inch long, which is really big for an insect egg. And after the mother bee lays her first egg, then she walls off that compartment that contains that pollen and that egg. And then she will repeat. And the wall itself is kind of a cool thing that you don't normally get to see, but if you open up a nest, this is one of those little sawdust walls between nest chambers. This one's been taken out. And she builds it in this neat spiral that you can see from the backside, how the how it was sort of built as a spiral, kind of like a braided rug. And then the front side that the mother bee is actually touching is very smooth. And so that egg in the back of the nest, it's there for a couple days and then it'll hatch. And this is a shot of an egg that's just about to hatch, which you can tell because you can see these little ridges on it. You're starting to see the segments of the larva that's about to hatch out of this egg. And this is a larva that's a few days old, also on its pollen provision. And then meanwhile, while that larva in the very first chamber is starting to develop, the female is adding additional chambers in front of it toward the nest entrance. And usually what we see about 6 to 8 nest chambers is pretty typical for one nest. So as the larvae eat that pollen, they grow bigger and bigger. This is another nest with older larvae in it. And then this is the first chamber that's unfinished. The mom has started to make a pile of pollen here, but she hasn't formed it into a loaf or laid an egg on it yet. And then for another perspective on the inside of the nest, this is actually an X-ray taken in early May after about a month of nest construction. So what you're seeing here is 5 separate nests. So this is a board, it's a 4x4 redwood board. This is a nest entrance that branches into 2 nests, one on the left, one on the right. And this is another nest entrance that branches into 1 nest on the right and then 2 on the left. And this one on the top left gives you a really good view of the pollen provisions. It's got 6 separate provisions, and then you can see 2 adult bees hanging out here near the nest entrance. One of those will be like the principal female who did most of the construction and egg laying. The other one was the one kind of waiting, hanging out, waiting for opportunities or maybe waiting for next year to actually nest. And then this nest on the bottom right gives you a really nice view of how the larvae are growing. So the one in the very back of the nest, of course, was laid as an egg first, and then the female worked her way toward the front of the nest. So the larvae in the back are the biggest, the ones in the front are the least developed. And they will actually roughly sort of emerge as adults in that order too. Most bees have it worked out to where there's not chaos during nest emergence when the people in the back are adults before the ones in the front. Carpenter bees, there's a little bit of mixing in there before everybody comes out. Anyway, then back over to the real world, out of the X-rays, here's another nest. These are full-grown larvae. They've completely finished their pollen balls. And then when we get to the back of the nest, you'll see this one has actually pupated. And that pupa is that transitional stage between the larva and the adult where the bee isn't really eating or moving around much. It's just reorganizing all of its body parts. Here's another nest with a couple of pupae in the back and a couple of younger but still large larvae in the front. But there's also a big problem in this nest. So let's talk a little bit about natural enemies of carpenter bees. If you can look closely in this 3rd chamber from the end, there's an intruder in there. There's actually 2 separate larvae, and the big one that you're seeing is a tiger bee fly. And the one that's all shriveled up behind it is the original carpenter bee larva. So let's talk a little bit about the tiger bee flies, because if you have a lot of carpenter bees on your property, you've probably seen this fly as well. I just clicked the wrong button. There we go. So this is the tiger bee fly as you would normally encounter it. You'll see that they're large, dark colored flies with these kind of light colored marks on their abdomens, and they've got sort of patterned wings. And in the summer, they hover around carpenter bee nest entrances and spray their tiny little eggs inside the nest entrance. And those eggs just hang out in there for several months. But in the spring, they hatch. And the tiny little bee fly larvae move through the nest and attach to a carpenter bee larva. So hopefully you can see it in this picture. The big larva here is the carpenter bee, and then this tiny little larva up near its head is the parasitic bee fly larva. And as it grows, this is now the bee fly larva. It has traded sizes with the carpenter bee larva. It has pretty much sucked the carpenter bee dry and grown itself, converted all that carpenter bee biomass into bee fly biomass, and then here it has pupated. And then it will emerge as the adult fly, which you saw a couple of pictures ago. And when the bee flies emerge in the summer, around the same time as the new carpenter bees, they'll also kick out these pupal cases. So sometimes you'll find these like on your porch or on your balcony underneath the carpenter bee nests. And while we're on the topic of natural enemies, this is the other really important one that calls attention to itself: woodpeckers. They seem to be fond of carpenter bee larvae as food, and they will come hammer open a carpenter bee nest to get at the bees inside. And you end up with damage that looks like this, that's perhaps even more undesirable than what the bees themselves do on their own. And so finally, if the bees make it past those threats, the brand new adults will come out of their pupae in June, July. But they don't usually leave the nest right away. They'll usually linger in there for even up to about a month before they actually come out and start flying around. But so that happens, you know, around here, mid to late summer. I'm seeing the very first ones start to appear for this year, but it'll be much more evident in like August through October. So that's what's going on with like the new generation that just developed as larvae, but we need to back up a step and talk about what happened to the parents. So the males that were hovering in your face in March, April, pretty much run out of steam in May, early June at the latest. All of that territorial hovering burns off energy faster than they consume it. And as the season goes, they literally get like skinnier and skinnier. They have less and less fat in their bodies, and eventually they just wear out. The females do last a little longer, but you see a big drop off in their activity by June as well. And then the exception are those females who live 2 years. They're still out foraging now, sort of building up their energy for the winter and to make a nesting attempt next spring. And then the new generation will finally join them out foraging in late July. Usually the females come out first, and then the males kind of come out in a wave around August. Again, in the Piedmont, your dates may vary. By September, you may see even a few mating attempts, but nothing like the spring frenzy with all of the territorial behavior. Mostly at this point, everybody's out kind of fattening up for the winter. Brothers and sisters keep sharing the same nest tunnels. There's no nesting activity, no sawdust, no egg laying until the following spring. And instead, these bees will kind of hunker down together in the nests over the winter. Usually, we think it's brothers and sisters who sort of developed in a nest will continue to use it for the winter as the place that they go to hibernate or have diapause. And then this is another X-ray of a bench board in October with groups of bees sort of sharing nests for the winter, and they'll stay in there until the next spring, February or March, when the whole cycle starts over again. So clearly we know a lot about carpenter bees and their life cycle. There are a lot of things we don't know that I imagine many of you probably would like to know, that I still don't have answers to. My lab has a little bit of carpenter bee research ongoing, and I want to share with you at least some of the questions that we're looking into, and hopefully I can have an update in a few years with some more useful information. One of the things that people most often want to know is like, how important is this damage? Like, is the structure going to collapse because of what the carpenter bees are doing to it? And we want to know that too, as well as sort of how broadly concerning this is to people and how much insecticide is getting deployed against carpenter bees. So we've started a long-term nesting study, and then we also have an ongoing survey of people about carpenter bees to kind of get some of these experiences and find out, you know, how has anybody ever experienced an actual like structural problem as a result? And then if you do have them, how can you stop them if you really can't coexist? Again, no great answers, but we have a long-term study where we've got benches on volunteers' porches, and each bench is
No, it wasn't windy at all.
Wood.
I sat outside, it's very comfortable.
Bees will nest in these make choices, prefer some woods over others, and we'll be able to, in the end, make recommendations about which woods are least likely to get drilled in. So far, the bees are not particularly collaborating. They're not nesting in any of them, but hopefully with time, they will move in and show preferences. And then we're also looking at some potential low impact treatments that could kill carpenter bees without concerns about broader environmental contamination or off-target effects on other bees. We also, another open question is why there's so many carpenter bees in town. Are they just as abundant in natural habitats where they're nesting in dead branches? And if they're not, like what's controlling their population there that isn't happening sort of here in town or around residences? Are nest sites limiting? Do they have natural enemies in natural areas that are missing from cities and so on? And then finally, of course, we're curious about what they're good for. We're involved in an ongoing search for potentially useful microbes from inside their nests. And in the long term, we'd like to get a better handle on, how important are they as pollinators? So far, scattered evidence suggests not great, but it's certainly not exhaustive. So we'd like to know more about what they're really doing out there. So that's it for today. Regardless of where you come down on the spectrum of their pests and I can't stand them versus their fascinating neighbors, I hope that you feel like you've gotten to know them a little bit better and have a better sense of what's going on inside those nests when you're not seeing adult bees out flying around. And so I would be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. At this point, I think I'll stop sharing so I can see everybody and turn it back over to Gabriella to orchestrate.
All right, so thank you very much, Elsa. That was some really great information and the pictures were really fun too. I especially like the video. It's always neat to see videos. So I guess let me start at the top. So Tony said that this is just a comment. This isn't a question. Carpenter bees are good pollinators of eggplant and tomatoes using sonification, buzz pollination. So do you just want to comment on that or thumbs up?
Sure, yeah, I think those plants also, I feel like bumblebees are like the real champions of some of those, but yeah, it's an interesting behavior where buzz pollination, where bees have to grab a flower, grab the stamens, the pollen bearing parts of the flower, and vibrate their wing muscles to shake the pollen off of it. And that's something honeybees can't actually do, but bumblebees and actually a variety of wild bees are good at doing that. And so I haven't personally seen carpenter bees doing that, but I'm happy to see that other people have observed it, and that may be another place that they're actually like providing some measurable benefit in a garden.
Okay. All right, the next question. Don wants to know, can carpenter bees affect the sex of their eggs the way that honeybees do?
Yes, great question. And they do. That's actually true of all bees and ants and most wasps, all wasps, that the female, once she mates, she stores like a stockpile of sperm in a particular organ in her body, and she can dispense that at will. So she can decide whether she's going to fertilize an egg or lay an unfertilized egg. And the fertilized eggs turn into females, and the unfertilized eggs turn into males. So it's very much like in honeybees, where they can determine, actively determine which sex egg they're actually going to produce. And some wasps even not only determine whether they're going to provision, like whether they're going to lay a male or a female egg, but then they actively provide food that's appropriate for one sex or the other. Like usually the males are smaller, they lay an unfertilized egg and they put it on a smaller provision, a smaller amount of food than they do when they're laying a female egg.
Okay, so this next question has a few parts to it. So the first part, with 6 to 8 egg chambers, in what order are the sexes deposited?
Usually the females are in the back and the males are in the front. And that's pretty typical of most bees. And that helps with the sort of disorder of emergence, where the bees in the back are starting to develop sooner and they might then be ready to emerge sooner. And there would be some sort of chaos when the bees in the back are ready to come out and the ones in the front aren't yet. Having the males in the front, because they're smaller and develop faster, tends to kind of counteract that out of orderness. In carpenter bees, it seems like they still kind of, the ones in the back are usually ready first, even though they are females and took longer to develop. And there's a lot of kind of, like when I've opened up nests late in the season, I find sort of females from the back walking around in the nest, and there's still male pupae in the front that they're kind of mixing with, and everybody just waits and comes out of the nest later. But anyway, I think I'm rambling beyond what was actually asked. I should let you pose the rest of the question.
So the last part of the question, actually, it sort of resonates what you just said. Do males wait for the females to emerge? But it doesn't really sound like there's a particular pattern. It's just sort of a free party.
Yeah, and it's, carpenter bees are funny because in most bees, the males don't overwinter. Like their carpenter bees are unusual in that the males and the females both come out in the late summer and the fall, they forage, they do stuff, and then they all go back in the nest and spend the winter and then mate in the spring. A lot of bees, nobody comes out until the spring. The males come out first, kind of get organized, and then they're waiting when the females come out. And we don't really see that with carpenter bees because they've kind of done this, like you said, kind of pre-party the previous season. And so actually in the summer, the females come out and start foraging before the males do, even though the males were like developing farther forward in the nest.
Well, so, and this is just sort of an aside to that question. When you were talking about the 6 to 8 egg chambers, how long does it typically take the female to complete that from start to finish?
That's a good question. I'm not positive. I want to say from what I've seen and what I've read that other people have seen, it usually takes a couple of days for an egg to hatch, probably a couple of days, like just to complete a chamber. Like once she's gotten the whole nest drilled and is then starting to fill it and lay eggs, probably a few days per chamber. And we find pretty complete nests by early May after about a month of nest building. There's probably some bad weather days in there that slow things down. So I'd say about a month to kind of get those 6 to 8 cells pulled together. And I saw in the chat, I glimpsed it, somebody asked if individual females make more than one nest. And sometimes they move around from one nest to another and may lay eggs in multiple places. Like they may drill one and then somebody else may manage to steal it from them. And then they go find another nest and try to dominate it and lay an egg there. So they may have multiple nests that way. I have not seen anybody actually drill, like complete a nest and then have time to drill another new nest and go fill it as well.
Okay. And so I guess, and you touched on this too, but typically, especially of a female, what would be considered an average lifespan of a female? Because the males, I guess, are a little bit different, but a female, what would her average lifespan look like?
Seems like there's kind of two strategies for the females there. So if everybody, let's just say everybody starts in July when they emerge from their pupae, and some females will try to nest the following spring and then die like in June. So they live a full year. And then some females will postpone nesting until the second year and then die the following June and they live 2 years. So they could go either way.
Okay. And so Chris says, since or if carpenter bees are considered marginal pollinators, and he says just another form of a termite, should we really be worried about exterminating them?
My worry with exterminating them is not that we would make carpenter bees go extinct as a result. I mean, there seem to be sort of, this is an incautious statement, but there seem to be plenty of them. They are abundant. I think they're probably going to be okay for a while. But I do worry about the non-target effects as well, like depending on how they're exterminated. A lot of times it means like spraying an entire side of a house or a balcony with a broad spectrum insecticide. And I worry about what else is encountering that insecticide, if it's drifting onto places that other bees might also encounter. A lot of recommendations are to treat individual nests by putting insecticide inside the nest and plugging it. And so that's probably a lower impact way of dealing with them if you can catch an infestation early enough that that's practical.
And then I've heard people say they don't put insecticide in the holes, but they just plug them. But if they're already developing larvae inside of there, that's not really helping the problem, correct? Because they would still be able to get out at some point.
Yeah, word has it that they would just chew out. I've heard mixed stories though. This is something I'm curious about, like to round up from our survey and then also potential future research, is whether you really need to put anything in there or if whether plugging the nest alone does it. It seems like they should be able to chew out, but I'm not positive.
And so you talked about this briefly, but just to verify, Julie is asking about the composition of the walls in between the chambers, sawdust plugs.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I was just like, what are they made of? It's definitely sawdust, and then there's clearly some binding agent in there that's probably bee spit, but I don't think anybody's ever actually actively watched them making it to look at like where the glue comes from that's holding that sawdust together. Some bees who are not carpenter bees use different glandular secretions from different parts of their bodies to assemble sort of the walls between their nest chambers. So I'm not sure exactly what else is in there besides sawdust.
And then Don wants to know, are their eggs and larvae an important food source for other animals? And could that be a reason other than pollination to tolerate their presence?
Yeah, I mean, woodpeckers certainly seem to like them. I don't know how big a component of the diet of urban woodpeckers is coming from carpenter bees. It's another thing I've wondered about. Don't know if we'll ever look at it. And then they're certainly supporting a whole like host of parasites and mites inside those nests. Like when sometimes you'll find, I showed you the bee flies, there are also cuckoo wasps that are parasites of carpenter bees. They're those really pretty iridescent green wasps. Sometimes you'll see them around the nest entrances. They're also parasites of carpenter bees. And then when you split open a nest, you'll often find it just full of mites, and who knows what they're all up to in there. They seem to be just kind of eating bee poop, but I don't know what else. So there's certainly a little ecosystem that's built in the carpenter bee nest that doesn't have sort of a clear economic ramification for people, but it's a fascinating little component of diversity to have, you know, in town.
And do carpenter bees ingest the sawdust while making the tunnels?
Nope, they just shave it off and kick it out. Like if you've got active nests, you'll see little piles of sawdust building up underneath it, and that's just fresh sawdust. It hasn't gone through bee digestion. It's just kicked out the nest entrance.
Okay, so I guess if you do have any other questions, please drop them in the chat. One question also that I get often is about using those fake wasp nests as deterrents, and some people swear by them and other people say it doesn't work one bit. So where do you fall on that argument?
I have no idea. I fall in a place of fascination. I can't imagine that, like, I hear a lot of people saying it works. There's so many stories that I feel like there's got to be something there. But also I'm not sure I believe the wasp nest interpretation, because I'll see, like I have had paper wasps and carpenter bees like nesting on the same piece of wood right next to each other. So I'm not sure what's going on with that. But maybe this is a good point to mention again, the little survey that we're doing. Like we're collecting these kind of stories to see if we can get a sense of like the things people have tried, and then how many people say that thing has worked versus no, it didn't work. So we can get a sense of some promising things to pursue with data to actually go out and measure, so we don't have to kind of take it, you know, take stories as the source of what we should do, but kind of put all those stories together, try to get a weight of evidence, and then pick some things to go out and measure.
So Elsa just dropped the link for that survey in the chat. So if you would click on that link or copy that link so you can take the survey at a later date and help her and her lab get some more information. So once you compile that data and learn more, is that something that you'll publish so that a general audience can read more about that? Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a student in my lab who's working with the survey data as part of her dissertation. So I doubt it's one of many things that she's working on. It'll be a few years before we probably have it really like synthesized and pulled together. But yes, once that is complete, we will try and publish it in a scientific journal, and then also have a version that we put out as, an extension document or something with an update on, here are the things that, yeah, here's our results.
All right, and then a couple more people have put some questions in the chat. Do carpenter bees dig through wood with natural finish versus painted or stained surfaces?
Another great question, and something we're also collecting experiences on. Certainly conventional wisdom, like if you read through all of the extension documents in the East that give advice on preventing carpenter bees, they all say that painting should reduce attack. But whenever I'm in a group of people and I say, try painting your wood, always hands go up and are like, but they're drilling in my painted XYZ. So maybe it slows them down, but it's certainly not foolproof, because there are lots of examples of painted structures that still get attacked.
Okay. And Emily wants to know if there are common pests or diseases shared with honeybees, for example, Varroa, AFB, etc.
Yeah, interesting. So definitely not Varroa, definitely not tracheal mites. Like those things are pretty specific to honeybees. There are probably some other parasites and viruses that are less obvious that are certainly shared between species. There's a good amount of research now showing that sort of honeybees and wild bees pass certain viruses and gut parasites back and forth to each other. But as far as carpenter bees being a threat to nearby honeybee colonies, it seems unlikely, but not particularly well documented.
And then this is a more broader question, but are there any citizen science projects you would recommend for studying bees?
Yes, there is, not necessarily for carpenter bees specifically, but a couple that are, I think there are 3 that come to mind immediately that I could recommend. There's Bumblebee Watch, and I don't have links for these off the top of my head, but I'll put the names in the chat. I think Bumblebee Watch is still active, and Gabriella, maybe and can jump in.
It is, and I'm looking for a link right now. I'll drop that.
Okay. And that's asking people to just submit photographs of bumblebees to better document, because bumblebees are one of the groups that seems to be, many species are declining, some species are endangered or being considered for listing as endangered, and they're really a group to kind of watch, to keep an eye on. Is their range shrinking? Is their abundance declining? And so this Bumblebee Watch project collects observations from anybody who wants to submit photos of bumblebees to try and get a handle on their status. Another one is Native Buzz. It is based in Florida. Sometimes their website works, sometimes it doesn't. It asks people to, like anywhere in the world, it's based in Florida, but anybody can participate, to put up bee hotels, those sort of nest blocks or nest houses for certain solitary bees and wasps, and report who's living in them. And one other great sunflower project, which is based in California, but again, anybody can participate. I think they're still taking participants as well. Asks you to plant a particular variety of sunflower, or I think they've also broadened it to other plants as well, and commit to doing a certain number of timed observations on that plant to record how many bumblebees, honeybees, green bees, certain groups, how often they show up. And they've done some great work sort of trying to relate bee abundance and sunflower pollination to, they've got data from across the whole country. So like the geography of the country, the amount of pesticides used in different regions. So that's another good one.
Yeah, and Tony mentioned too, Ohio State University Bee Lab. If you go to their website, I can try to pull that up in a moment. Okay. They actually have a wealth of all kinds of different resources. They've done lots of webinars. They always post really helpful links. There's just a lot of great information on that website. So I'll try to find that and post it, because I think that you'd also be able to find some other citizen science-based projects on that website.
Great idea.
It's about this. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. I guess one last question. Another question I get often is if you don't want to kill your carpenter bees and you don't want to put up traps to kill them, another method of determining, can you put up blocks of wood adjacent to where your carpenter bees are hanging out in hopes of luring them to the block of wood? How effective is that?
I would suspect not very, because they tend to want to reuse the same nests year after year. And so even if, not everybody, each nest produces several new females, and if they all succeed, they can't all reuse that same nest. They're going to have to kind of go somewhere else. So you may see those new boards getting colonized, but it doesn't mean they're leaving the original one. That's still probably getting used and lengthened. A lot of times bees will just start a new nest like right next to the one that they came out of. So I'm not like, try it. I can't say it absolutely doesn't work, but I suspect, based on what I know about kind of their life cycle and their habits, that it wouldn't result in them abandoning the original infested area.
And then, so Tony mentioned some Xerces bumblebee project. There are bumblebee atlas projects in the Pacific Northwest and a few other states in the western part of the country. And we are hopefully in the process of organizing something like that for North Carolina, as well as a couple of other southern states. Like I said, fingers crossed, if all goes well, then we are hoping to roll that out in the spring. So that would be something that would be very relevant to this area. You would go out, you would adopt a plot and do bumblebee surveys, and there would be lots of instruction and directions on how to do that, so everybody could figure out what you're seeing, the bumblebees that you're seeing. But stay tuned for more information. We will post that on our website and our social media outlets, as well as our partner websites, as soon as we learn more information. So hopefully that is to come down the road. But I don't see any other questions. So
I just put one more citizen science thing in the chat, like one that's related to a project my lab is working on, and I almost forgot to mention it. My lab works particularly on effects of urban warming on bee abundance and diversity and pollination. We've got an ongoing project looking at bee health and pollination in community gardens in 10 cities in the US. But we can't go to every garden. And if anybody in an urban or non-urban garden wants to upload iNaturalist photos, that'll help us get a handle on how bees are distributed relative to urban hotspots. So I just put a link for that iNaturalist project in the chat too.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. So let's everybody thank Elsa for her presentation and for answering so many questions, and maybe drop a note of thanks and appreciation in the chat, because we certainly do appreciate learning more about carpenter bees. And we hope that we will see you back tomorrow at 1 o'clock for John Gerwin's talk on butterflies and moths in North Carolina. And then same on Thursday, we're going to learn more about beneficial insects. So we're going to look above and beyond just pollinators. So unless there are any last minute questions, thanks again, Elsa. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who joined.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.